Right now, in the Atlantic Ocean, a floating city of glass and steel is carrying something it was never designed for. On board a Dutch-flagged cruise ship, fewer than 10 people have fallen gravely ill, and 3 of them are already dead. The virus responsible has killed a large share of the people it infects in some past outbreaks, sometimes close to half. The World Health Organization and European health authorities confirmed that at least 6 of these cases are hantavirus infections, all identified as Andes virus, a strain usually associated with wild rodents in South America, not with sunset cocktails on the open sea. In the official updates, they describe a cluster of severe respiratory illness on the cruise ship MV Hondius, a vessel that left the southern tip of South America with passengers and crew from many countries, only to become the stage for a medical mystery in motion. As of early May 2026, reports mention 8 cases linked to the ship and 3 deaths, and the vessel is still sailing while patients struggle for their lives in hospitals across several continents. So how did a virus that usually lives quietly in wild rodents end up on a modern cruise ship? How did something tied to cabins, barns, and disturbed dust find its way into the filtered air of a floating hotel? And is this the beginning of another global crisis, or just a frightening echo from the past, amplified by the word virus and our memories of lockdowns and empty streets? To understand what actually woke up on that cruise ship, we have to leave the breaking news behind and go back into the dust. We have to follow this virus home, into the hidden spaces where it has lived alongside us for longer than any of our ships have sailed. Hantaviruses are not a single villain, but an entire family of viruses, carried mainly by rodents, mice, rats, voles, and their relatives, spread across different regions of the world. Each hantavirus tends to have its favorite host and its own map, one species of mouse or rat in one part of the world, another species somewhere else. In the Americas, several of these viruses are notorious for causing hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, or HPS, a severe lung disease that can turn from flu-like to life-threatening in a matter of hours. Unlike many infections that sweep through human crowds, hantaviruses spend most of their time inside these small mammals, moving quietly from rodent to rodent, generation after generation. Humans usually enter the story by accident. The main route is not a cough in a crowd, but a breath taken in the wrong place at the wrong time. People inhale tiny particles from rodent urine, droppings, saliva, or nesting material that have been stirred into the air. This often happens in very ordinary situations, sweeping out a cabin that has been closed all winter, cleaning a shed or barn, opening a storage room or grain silo that has become a mouse hotel. In these enclosed spaces, after they've been shut for days or months, the air can hold a fine dust that carries the virus deep into human lungs with a single careless sweep of a broom. After that invisible moment of exposure, nothing dramatic happens right away. The incubation period can stretch from about 1 week to as long as 6 weeks, which means the calendar may flip once or twice before the first symptoms appear. At first, the illness looks like many other infections: fever, muscle aches, headache, nausea, sometimes abdominal pain that could easily be mistaken for a stomach bug or a bad day. Then, for some patients, a line is crossed. The disease shifts into hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. The lungs begin to fill with fluid, breathing becomes fast and difficult, blood pressure drops, and the body slides toward shock. In the first big outbreak recognized in the United States in 1993 in the Four Corners region, more than half of the known patients died, and even broader national data from that year showed fatality rates above 50%. Later analyses of many years of cases suggest that, overall, hantavirus pulmonary syndrome often kills around 30 to 40% of the people it strikes, depending on the outbreak and the level of intensive care available. To make sense of how this virus behaves compared to something like COVID-19, it helps to imagine personalities. COVID-19 was an extrovert virus. It spread easily between humans through droplets and aerosols, thriving in crowded indoor spaces, finding new hosts at birthday parties, in offices, on buses and trains, often even before people knew they were sick. Hantavirus, by contrast, is an introvert virus. Most hantaviruses do not spread easily between humans at all. They prefer to stay quietly inside their rodent hosts, circulating out of sight. Humans usually become infected only by accident, when we stir up contaminated dust and breathe it in. For most hantavirus species, we are usually a dead-end host. The virus reaches us, kills some of us, and then stops. It does not use us as its highway. And yet, on that ship, we are watching the one member of this introvert family that sometimes breaks that rule. In 1993, long before this cruise ship ever left port, another mystery began far from the ocean, in the high desert of the American Southwest. Healthy young adults in the Four Corners region, where New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah meet, started arriving at hospitals with what looked at first like a bad flu. They had fever, muscle pain, and fatigue, the kind of symptoms that could easily be blamed on overwork or a seasonal bug. Then suddenly, their lungs failed. Within hours, some of them went from walking into an emergency room to being unable to breathe on their own, and then to dying despite intensive care. By the time investigators realized they were dealing with a new disease, 17 of the first 33 known patients in that region had already died, and across the United States that year, more than half of the confirmed cases did not survive. What followed was a detective story that stretched from hospital wards into canyons and barns. Teams of epidemiologists and virologists traced the pattern of illness back to a virus that had not been recognized in humans before, later named sin nombre virus, the virus with no name, carried by the deer mouse, Paramiscus maniculatus, a small, unremarkable animal that had been living around people all along. As they collected rodents and mapped the landscape, they noticed something else. The outbreak followed an unusually wet period that had transformed the dry land. Rainfall had boosted vegetation and piñon nut production, which in turn fed a boom in deer mouse populations. More mice meant more droppings in and around human homes and workspaces, and more chances for people to inhale contaminated dust. The spike in human deaths was not a random curse appearing out of nowhere. It was the visible tip of a chain that started with rain, plants, nuts, and mice. For Navajo communities in the region, the idea that changes in the land and changes in mice could be tied to sickness in people was not surprising. Reports from that time describe how Navajo knowledge had long linked bad air and illness to increases in mice after shifts in weather and environment. Elders emphasized that this was not an unknown alien evil suddenly descending in 1993, but part of a cycle in nature that had been observed before, remembered in stories rather than plotted on charts. It took modern epidemiology months to see what Navajo elders already knew. When the land changes, the mice change, and when the mice change, the air itself can become dangerous. Hantaviruses, in other words, are not new inventions of the 2020s. They are ancient, cyclical, and tightly bound to the ecology of rodents and climate, becoming visible to us only when the chain of events lines up in a way that pushes them into human lungs. If most hantaviruses are introverts that stay with their rodent hosts and stop in humans, the virus on that cruise ship is the exception that keeps experts awake at night. Andes virus is a New World hantavirus found mostly in Chile and Argentina, where it has caused repeated outbreaks of hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, with fatality rates often around 30 to 40%, even with access to modern care. Like sin nombre virus, it attacks the lungs and the cardiovascular system, causing fluid buildup, respiratory failure, and shock. But unlike almost every other hantavirus we know, Andes virus has proved that it can sometimes move from one person to another.
That single difference changes how we have to think about it.
Over the past few decades, investigators in Chile and Argentina have documented chains of person-to-person transmission of Andes virus, especially among close household contacts and sexual partners, and in a few cases among healthcare workers who had intense, unprotected contact with patients. Studies suggest that this spread tends to happen in the early phase of illness, before the most severe lung symptoms appear, when infected people may still be at home, sharing beds, talking at close range, or being cared for without strict protection. In these human-to-human events, incubation periods have ranged roughly from about 9 days to as long as 40 days after exposure, echoing the long, quiet lead-in seen in rodent-borne infections. This makes Andes virus unique in its family, still an introvert compared to something like SARS-CoV-2, but one that occasionally crosses the line into human networks. In the current cruise ship cluster, international health agencies report that laboratory testing has identified Andes virus as the cause of the confirmed cases. They also stress something important. So far, there is no evidence that the virus itself has changed in a way that would make it more contagious than in past outbreaks. The ship's environment, close living quarters, shared indoor spaces, long stretches of time spent together, does raise the risk that the small amount of person-to-person transmission Andes virus is capable of could occur more than once. But even in those close contact settings, the pattern from previous outbreaks has been that each sick person, on average, infects fewer than one other person. In practical terms, that means Andes virus tends to burn through small clusters and then fade, rather than exploding into exponential global spread. Public health risk assessments reflect that balance. The World Health Organization and regional agencies currently judge the risk for passengers and crew on the ship as moderate because they were in that confined environment, but the risk to the general population as low. For people who were not on the ship and are not living or working in areas where Andes virus circulates in rodents, the immediate danger from this specific cluster is small. This is where the idea of a virus being too lethal to travel comes in. With Andes virus, the combination of severe disease and limited human-to-human transmission means that, on average, an infectious person tends to pass it to fewer than one new person. That keeps outbreaks from turning into something like COVID-19, even if the stories from within those small outbreaks are as heartbreaking on an individual level as anything we saw during the pandemic.
When people hear deadly respiratory virus on a cruise ship, their minds jump to the same question. Is this the next COVID? On the surface, the stories rhyme. A virus, a confined space, people falling suddenly and severely ill. But underneath, the biology is almost inverted. COVID-19, caused by SARS-CoV-2, spreads efficiently via respiratory droplets and fine aerosols, especially in crowded indoor spaces, and it can move from person to person even when the infected person has no symptoms yet. Hantaviruses, including Andes virus, are different. Their main pathway into humans is still the old one, inhaling dust contaminated with rodent urine, droppings, or saliva, usually in enclosed spaces where rodents have been nesting. Human-to-human spread has been documented only for Andes virus, and even then, mostly among very close contacts. That difference is reflected in how easily each virus travels through a population. For COVID-19, early estimates of the basic reproduction number, R0, were above 2 in communities with no immunity or protection, meaning each infected person, on average, infected at least 2 others, with superspreader events sending that number much higher in crowded settings. For Andes hantavirus, detailed outbreak investigations suggest that the average number of new infections caused by each sick person stays below 1, even in households and healthcare settings where close contact occurs. Instead of long chains of transmission, we see short branches that stop. The timelines are different as well. COVID-19 typically incubates over about 2 to 14 days after exposure, while hantavirus infections often take 1 to 6 weeks to declare themselves, and human-to-human Andes virus cases have shown incubation periods roughly between 9 and 40 days. On severity, the flip flips again. Once testing and care scaled, COVID-19's overall case fatality generally sat in the low single digits, often under 2%, though it was higher in older and vulnerable groups. Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, whether from sin nombre or Andes virus, has repeatedly shown case fatality rates in the 30 to 60% range in past outbreaks, though intensive care can improve those odds. Put together, this is why expert reviews and agencies keep repeating the same message. Hantavirus is very unlikely to cause a pandemic like COVID-19. The virus is far deadlier when you happen to be the unlucky person who inhales it, but it is fundamentally bad at moving between humans. COVID-19 was not the deadliest virus per case, but it was extraordinarily good at traveling between us, riding breath and proximity to circle the globe. Hantavirus is the opposite. It exacts a heavy toll in the small clusters it reaches, then tends to burn out instead of catching fire worldwide. Feeling the weight of those facts, the next question is practical and personal. If this is not the next COVID, what should any of us actually do? Right now, public health agencies looking at the cruise ship outbreak and the broader situation still assess the risk to the general population as low. Their focus is on the people with direct exposure, passengers and crew from the ship, and those in regions where Andes virus circulates in wild rodents. There is no recommendation for broad travel bans or generalized lockdowns. Instead, the emphasis is on classic outbreak control. Identify contacts of confirmed cases, monitor them through the long incubation window, and be ready to isolate and treat anyone who develops early symptoms. For everyone else, the most useful actions are about reducing the chance of rodent-borne exposure in the environments we can control. If you need to clean a cabin, shed, barn, or storage room that may have rodent droppings, the steps are simple but crucial. First, ventilate the enclosed space by opening doors and windows for at least 30 minutes before you start cleaning, letting fresh air dilute whatever might be lingering. Wear gloves to protect your hands. Never dry sweep or vacuum rodent droppings or nests that can throw virus particles into the air right where you are breathing. Instead, soak rodent droppings, urine stains, and nesting material thoroughly with a disinfectant solution, such as diluted household bleach, and let it sit for several minutes so it can inactivate the virus. Then wipe everything up with disposable towels, bag the waste, and wash your hands carefully with soap and water. In hospitals caring for suspected Andes virus patients, strict infection prevention measures and appropriate protective equipment for close contact staff are essential to block the small amount of human-to-human transmission this virus is capable of. As for vaccines and treatments, hantavirus is not an uncharted mystery. Scientists have been mapping it since the 1990s, and by 2026, several lines of defense are being designed, even if they are not yet standard tools. There is still no widely licensed, routinely used vaccine for the New World hantaviruses that cause hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. Treatment in real-world outbreaks is mainly supportive intensive care, providing oxygen, mechanical ventilation, and sometimes advanced support like extracorporeal membrane oxygenation to keep patients alive while their immune systems fight the virus. At the same time, research groups are developing vaccine candidates using approaches that became familiar during COVID-19, mRNA platforms, protein subunit vaccines that present stabilized viral glycoproteins, and viral vectored designs, many of them tested in animal models like Syrian hamsters. Some teams are also working on monoclonal antibody therapies that target hantavirus proteins, aiming to neutralize the virus early in infection, though these remain experimental and not widely available. The story here is not that hantavirus is invisible to science, but that it has been comparatively neglected because its outbreaks are small and sporadic. Now, with the world's attention briefly fixed on a ship in the Atlantic, there is a chance that work long in progress gets the support it needs. For most people watching, the question beneath all the data is simple. Should I be afraid of this cruise ship virus?
The clearest, honest answer, based on what we know today, is that the tragedy on that ship is real. But for now, it is a contained battle, not the start of another world-spanning war. The families and patients at the center of this outbreak are living through something terrifying, and they deserve care, transparency, and support. But if you are far from that ship and not working in rodent-infested environments, the risk is extremely low. The most powerful thing you can do is remember the quiet lessons: how to clean safely if you ever have to deal with rodent droppings, how closely our health is tied to the ecologies we alter, and how different viruses can be from one another behind the shared word outbreak. We like to think we have sealed ourselves off from the wild, with steel walls, filtered air, and endless lights at sea. Yet the wild is patient. It moves through weather, through mice, through dust. And sometimes all it takes is a single breath in a forgotten corner of a cabin to remind us that we are still just biology. If this helped you understand why hantavirus is not the next COVID, share it with someone who has only seen the headlines.